Um, Hello, everybody. How are you? My name is Adela Pineda, and I am the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies at UT Austin. Today, it is a real privilege to introduce two very respected and appreciated colleagues of mine, David Carballo and Jaime Marroquin. I say David, it's David, but I call him David, the Mexican Spanish way, and Jaime Marroquin. David Carballo is professor of anthropology, archaeology, and Latin American studies at Boston University, where he's also the associate provost for general education. He specializes in the archaeology of Latin America, especially Central Mexico, and with topical interest in households, urbanism, religion, social inequality, and working with contemporary communities in understanding ancient ones. Current investigations focus on Teotihuacan's Tlaxinga district, which is a cluster of non-elite neighborhoods on the periphery of what was then the largest city in the Americas. And he's working in this recent book, published in 2013, Cooperation and Collective Action, Archaeological Perspectives, Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central Mexico, Teotihuacan, the World Beyond the City, and this very most recent one we are going to be talking about, Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain. Jaime Marroquin is a specialist in Mexico and Greater Mexico's cultural history from a global and transnational perspective. And his work analyzes exchanges of knowledge between Amerindian and European cultures and their significance for the emergence of early modern science and thought. He also studies the history of Greater Mexico as seen from an ethnographic tradition. He also has several books. I should quote Diálogos con Quetzalcóatl, Humanismo, Etnografía y Ciencia, and La Historia de los Perjuicios en América, La Conquista. He has co-edited Translating Nature, Cross-Cultural Histories of Early Modern Science, and Open Borders to a Revolution. Jaime will be the discussant today after David Carballo gives us some insights into his recent exploration of the collision of worlds. Why we are inviting him today, as you know, 1521 was the year of the fall of Tenochtitlan. So David is inaugurating a series of talks that we will be having in a form of a seminar next semester on the role or on how we can recall this major event to understand our present, particularly through the lens of knowledge and of experience. Why we can think of the many layers of cultures that are involved in the genealogies that followed this major event. I think there is no other person more apt to discuss this from a material culture lens than David Carballo. So thank you, David, for joining us. As I said, he was my beloved colleague at Boston University not too long ago.
Thank you, Adela. Hello to everyone. Saludos in Facebook. I'd just like to, voice my appreciation for Adela for the invitation. It was so bittersweet losing her to Texas. She was such a wonderful director of Latin American studies here at BU. She really elevated the program to levels it had not seen since I arrived at this campus over 10 years ago, and it's certainly our loss as Texas's gain, and it's wonderful she can be back at her alma mater and guiding, it probably is, or surely is the strongest Latin American studies program in this country. And I'd also like to say thanks to Paloma for her assistance and Jaime for agreeing to provide some commentary on the book and on the presentation. So here you're looking at the cover, and I just wanted to start with that more to discuss the mural that you're looking at. And this mural was a personal choice for me. It was done by the Mexican artist Desiderio Hernandez Xochitl, and it's part of a series of murals that's in the Presidencia or City Hall of Tlaxcala. And I have worked in Tlaxcala off and on since 1999 or so, over 20 years. And so some of my interest in doing this book came from that experience of working in Tlaxcala and becoming really fascinated by the role of indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalteca in these momentous events of 500 years ago, and just more broadly, other native Mesoamerican groups, seeing these events, which are not, of course, just 1519 to 1521, although that's where we're at in terms of commemoration. That's a short interval of the Spanish and Aztec War, but really a much more protracted process that I see as fraught and exploitative in its colonial reach, but also co-creative in the fact that indigenous peoples were part of the forging of a new order of New Spain. So these murals that Desiderio made tell of largely of the Republic of Tlaxcalan. And of course, Republic is the very word that Cortés used in his letters, especially the second letter sent back to the King of Spain, Carlos I. And it sort of encapsulates some of the violent collision of these two worlds that were previously unknown to one another. It frames certain key personages like Cortés, but then also Xicontecatl the Elder at left, who was one of the rulers of a large ruling council. And this is why Cortés called Tlaxcalan a republic. He compared it to the Renaissance republics of northern Italy, like Venice and Genoa and Pisa. And in the center is the woman known by various names like Marina or Malinche or Malinsli, who is the key translator of this encounter in being able to speak Nahuatl and Mayan. The mural also has some personal connection to me because Pedro Cawancin Hernandez is a colleague and was an artist who worked with me starting in Tlaxcala and then in Teotihuacan since the late 2000s. And he was a great nephew of the muralist who made these murals. And Pedro really tragically passed away due to COVID early in the pandemic. And many of the artifact illustrations that you see in this book are in Pedro's hand. Well, I've been dedicating many things to him, and including this talk, and he is certainly sorely missed. Okay. So there are also some Texas ties to this book, other than having Adela and Jaime here. Part of the genesis of the book came with, I had done an earlier book with Oxford on urbanization and religion in central Mexico. And in talking with the acquisitions editor, he mentioned a book by my colleague, Alan Covey, who of course is at Texas in anthropology, who was starting this book on now called Inca Apocalypse. And actually, in reading the two, I think they're very complementary books to one another. We had slightly different approaches, but being archaeologists, they do frame a lot of material and visual culture more than some other treatments. And so Alan and I met in Austin to discuss our nascent book projects. I'm not exactly sure what year, but whenever I came to the Mesoamerican meetings that are held there at UT, it might have been 6 or so years ago. And those are run by Dave Stewart and Astrid Rungelier, who's they're more Texas folk. Dave has worked on the murals that you see at top right. This is one of the color plates. I had to lobby for a certain number of color plates, and one, or this illustration done by Heather Hurst of this scribal training center at the Maya site of Xiltun, and to juxtapose that with another image of Salamanca as a training site for many of the conquistadors and friars who came to the Americas. And making the, I think, somewhat obvious point to this audience that, that indigenous people had their own systems of knowledge production and even compulsory schooling in the case of the Aztec system that we know of. And then finally, also to mention my colleague, Enrique Rodriguez Alegria, whose work on the colonial period I drew on heavily in writing that particular chapter. So in general, my orientation to this book, it's an academic press, but it's within their trade line. So it's meant to be more accessible to a non-specialist audience, but at the same time, knowing that, as my guiding principles, my colleagues in Mexico in particular, and the way that archaeologists talk about these events in Mexico was something that I wanted to highlight. So I do call it a deep history, and in that way it has some parallels to Braudel longue durée, but also in the case of being an archaeologist, thinking about stratigraphy, digging down deeper and finding earlier layers of human history. So the focus is on material culture and landscapes, and through an archaeological lens, which I hope allows us to see both the similarities and differences of the sequences of Mesoamerica and Iberia. So the actual places, and then the physical things we call artifacts or art and sites, and where they become entangled, especially in the colonial period. But even before then, how the cultures of Mesoamerica and Iberia both built on each other cumulatively over millennia. And so some of the book goes back to the first agriculturalists, what was the first farmers in these regions, and how did things develop from then to the Aztecs or to Castilian Spain on the eve of empire. So other books framed as big history also have done this. So for instance, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, but those aren't arguments that archaeologists often think are very interesting. Like, there's technological differences, sure, there's differences in the timing of agriculture, but what I wanted to focus a little more on are the social institutions and how people thought and how these two cultural spheres came into contact with each other. So, in some ways, this is a little more in line with David Graeber and David Wengrow's new book, The Dawn of Everything, in thinking of the vast spectrum of human social organization. And in fact, that book draws on our work at Teotihuacan and other colleagues who've been working in Tlaxcala and the socio-political organization of that polity on the eve of the alliance with the Spanish. And so as an example, we're more interested in the social institutions and their commonalities and differences. So as an example, the direct control empires of many parts of Iberia that are the legacies of Roman imperialism there, and then also as part of Islamic Spain, as models for then what became a Castilian focused empire and a growing national project, versus the more indirect control empires known in Mesoamerica. This is a way that archaeologists and comparative historians frame it in terms of how are people affected, impacted, manipulated through imperial expansion, and of course indirect control ones like the Aztec Empire are more hands-off. They are more interested in realigning tax and tributary relations, but they don't build the sort of garrisons and the colonial outposts that you see in direct control empires. And that's an important distinction, because it meant that there were different mental models in people's heads, native peoples and Spaniards, as this encounter was unfolding. Another difference might be the more absolutist religion of Catholicism at this time versus a more incorporative model in the Aztec system, which was just kept through conquest, accumulating more and more deities and just accepting them and not imposing their own patron deity, the Mexica patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, on other peoples. So just to go quickly through some of this, a few chapters frame this deep history of of naval exploration through the Mediterranean. That, of course, starts with the Phoenicians and then Carthaginians, and then Roman expansion, the importance of metallurgy and mineral extraction. Iberia became a real important core region for this. For a while, that image on top, the Las Medulas mine in León was the most productive gold mine in the entire Roman Empire. It looks like a scene from the American Southwest, but those are it's an anthropogenic landscape, meaning it was through Roman fracking, through running water through this area that they would obtain the gold and destroy these mountains in the process. And so here, of course, this is Cortés's hometown of Medellin, a place that we can see deep history as like a palimpsest of cultures in this one mound or hilltop overlooking the Guadiana river valley of Extremadura. So for instance, there's a Roman theater built into it. On top, there is a fortress that was started in the Islamic period. It has water cisterns, aljibes, and then it became a Christian Reconquista fortress. And here we have the church to San Martin, where Cortés himself was baptized. That's overlying a Roman temple to Pluto. So just this sort of like the building of history, the incremental history of the built environment. Or looking at the infrastructure of Roman Hispania, the road systems, the sorts of urban patterns that were laid down in that era, and then the medieval period and the Islamic Christian conflicts, known of course to conquistadors as the Reconquista, as problematic as that term is for a process that lasted 700 years and what was it previously reclaiming, et cetera. But through that process, the social institutions is what I was particularly interested in. So things like the adelantado de la frontera, which was the advancement of the frontier as the Christian frontier was moving farther south, and the people who were authorized to settle or to conquer, that became a title that was really important in the colonization of the Americas. Likewise, the encomienda as a land holding institution, and then also the militarization or the change in Santiago as this more benign pilgrim to Santiago Matamoros and being militarized for this particular event. So, some part of those histories are often told in books on the Conquista, especially the more recent ones, like starting with so-called Reconquista history. But often neglected are the waves of history and interaction within Mesoamerica itself. So we often just get the Aztecs and they were nomadic people, but really they're just, of course, millennia of civilizations in central Mexico. And as an archaeologist, that's something I've worked on, of looking from the formative period back in the first millennium BCE, where you have the first cities develop, places like Cuicuilco in the south of Mexico City, and you have the formation of a identifiable pantheon of deities and practices of cremation and what these deities are associated with, and certain lines of continuity to follow. And the Mexica Aztecs themselves were very much self-conscious of this history and referential to it within the holiest of holies, the Templo Mayor, the great temple in Mexico City. You see all of these styles. So you see the ritual deposition of the much earlier artifacts from the Olmec culture. And you see temples like the one on the bottom right, which are in a neo-Teotihuacano style, like they're in a pseudo-tablero style that looks like Teotihuacan. And then you have in the Casa de las Águilas to the north, you have pseudo-Toltec reliefs that are look very much like ones at the site of Tula in Hidalgo. And in the middle, Xochicalco, the writing system of the Mexica, was largely based on epiclassic writing. And so this is some of the work that colleagues such as Leonardo Lopez Lujan and his recently departed father, Alfredo Lopez Austin, have worked on, also Javier Urcid, who worked on the writing system. And so many colleagues have been working on this. But the broader point here is that, these, as Eric Wolf said, these are not people without history. These are people who were framing historical memory and social memory through previous cultures that go back thousands of years also. So, so that then brings us to a point of comparison. So thinking about, how did these social institutions develop? How were people socialized as part of new generations? And that gets us to questions like pedagogy and learning. And so the schools, the Calmecac and the Telpochcali, which were schools of the Aztecs, or here you have that Maya Scribal Training Center from Chiltún, versus the University of Salamanca, who Hernán Cortés and Bernal Díaz de Castillo both came out of Salamanca. So two people with a very different orientation to the colonial endeavor studied at this university. They had very different tracks. One studied law to be a letrado, and the other one was a theologian and had a richer, more humanistic training. And so we can think about those issues of curricula. This is I don't know if anyone has been following the comic book Aztec Empire, which Paul Guignen is developing, but it's a zine comic style, and so this image is taken out of that. But just thinking of the knowledge production and the sorts of centers of learning and that would have had codices associated with them in Tenochtitlan. The main event that most books are framed around are, of course, the interval largely of 1519 to 1521, what we think of as the Spanish-Aztec War. And that was the first incursions by Córdoba and then Grijalva, neither of which, and Cortés as well, were designated the Adelantado. The Adelantado was the governor of Cuba, and others, Cortés, of course, was not authorized to conquer, just to explore. And so that was part of the justification for letter writing back to the king for this breach of command. Thinking about this landscape is one that I've also done as an archaeologist. So the map that you see of the Meseta or the Altiplano Central is one that I and other colleagues have thought about in terms of ancient cultures peoples of ancient cultures moving across the landscape and using things like GIS modeling to think about where were the best routes of communication, and did these become important trade routes. And colleagues such as Matthew Restall have then pointed out that many of these trade routes that were pre-existing pre-Hispanic trade routes then became the main corridors of future military campaigns and colonial period exchange and settlement as well. So the landscape was important and a sort of an agent in these events, if you will. Other colleagues, so Roberto Junco is in the Subdirección de Arqueología Acuática, the underwater archaeology division of INA, and he and his team have been making really incredible discoveries off the coast of Veracruz, where they seem to have the spots of the three boats of Cortés's original expedition, and one of them had wood remaining on it that could be radiocarbon dated, and the dates work out to just a little over 500 years ago. The actual species of wood grows in northern Spain in the Cantabria region. So he really seems to have identified Cortés's lost ships, and also at the same time dispelling this myth that developed later in later heroic poetry about these events, that Cortés had burned his ships, which he didn't do. He scuttled them. He took the fixing so he could build brigantines in the final assault on Tenochtitlan. When people come up to the expedition comes up to the highlands, it now has a few Totonacs who were indigenous peoples of Veracruz. And the Totonacs were the people who advised Cortés to come through Tlaxcala because they knew that the Tlaxcaltecas were enemies to the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance, particularly the Mexica. So the Tlaxcalteca actually had some alliances previously with Texcoco, the second largest city-state of the Triple Alliance. And this is a region that I've mostly worked in Tlaxcala, in northern Tlaxcala. And there we can see this area was an Otomi buffer zone between Nahuatl, dominant Nahuatl Tlaxcalteca to the south, the main sort of polity, and then these smaller Otomi polities that also were not incorporated into the empire. And through ceramic analysis, one of my former students, Laura Heath Stout, did a paper on this, of seeing how connected these Otomi peoples were into the broader Aztec world here. And also I do some focus on where exactly did this first initial encounter of Tecoac occur. So some authors have suggested a site that's farther to the south, but it just doesn't work with calculating distances that are recorded in leagues by Cortés and by Bernal Diaz, and knowing the archaeology of this region that we think we've identified, along with other colleagues, where the outskirts of this first encounter with Otomis and later with the Tlaxcaltecas occurred at Tecoac. Another interesting theme here is the differences in the strategic presentation by the Tlaxcalteca of these events in documents like the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, this famous long, large cloth rendering of Tlaxcala's history, and also by the Mestizo historian Diego Muñoz Camargo, his history of Tlaxcala. So those narratives, one textual and one visual, or the textual one also has images like this last one that you see over here comes out of Muñoz Camargo. They depict these key events of encounter into Tlaxcala at a site called Teotihuacan, which is coming through the mountain pass, place of the alder trees, it means, to Tecoatzingo, this first, where we know there was fighting. Cortés and Bernal Diaz both and others talk about that. Or then the return after the Noche Triste to Hueyotlipan to then again reinforce that alliance with the Tlaxcalteca. You can see that the colonial period Tlaxcalteca, of course, present these as all peaceful encounters, right? And ones where they're providing food and lodging for the Spaniards. Now, we can contrast that with another document. This is a wonderful document known as the Codex Huamantla, or the Mapa de Huamantla, this really long document that seems to be in a narrative style that starts from like the Cave of Origin at Chichimostoc and the movement through into the Basin of Mexico and then into Tlaxcala. In this image, one of these, the last ones, shows this encounter, and this initial encounter probably at Tecoac, and it's a very bloody encounter. It's very different. There are the presentation of objects and jade beads and other things, but you can see probably Cortés and Alvarado here with on horseback with pikes, and the tragic violence associated with this colonial endeavor, and the toll that it had on native peoples like the Otomi, in this case around Huamantla. So a very different rendering, and the Otomi were not petitioning the Spanish crown for semi-autonomy of an Indian republic in the way that the Tlaxcaltecas were, and so they presented this image differently than you see, say, on the Lienzo de Tlaxcala. So much of the work of my colleagues then, like for instance, Aurelio Lopez, who's from INA Tlaxcala, and then also Lane Farger and team who've worked mapping the pre-Hispanic ruins of Tlaxcalan, have shown that, again, the colonial documents, of course, were written with a particular agenda, and represent a confederation of 4 different altepetls, 4 different city-states. But that's not actually what we see archaeologically. The archaeology tells us of one integrated city. So this urban expanse of terraces and plazas, not one sort of large central place with a big pyramid. It's a very different model of a Mesoamerican city, although it does have some antecedents. Those of you who know the site of Cantona in northern Puebla, there's some similarities to this sort of layout, but it's a very different social structure. So that, along with the references that we have by Cortés and others, really hint at a different form of organization. And so, of course, the Tlaxcaltecas and others, people of Texcoco and Huehuetenango and other native peoples who became allies in this military campaign, then continued with other excursions that helped to create New Spain. So, for instance, it's from the Lienzo again, and going in Panuco. So, of course, the role of disease really can't be overstated. It began in 1520 and decimated native populations, including one of the Aztec emperors, the successor to Moctezuma, and the amount of extraction and slave-like labor practices. But some of these objects then have been found and also tell us of this story. You see this what's called a teco, or that bullion that's on the bottom, was found around the Alameda Central, and people think it could have come from the gold the Spaniards were trying to take out of the city during the Noche Triste, now also reframed as the Noche Victoriosa, when the Mexica expelled the Spaniards from the capital. And then also this other image on the bottom left that was found in a shipwreck off of Veracruz, but it had already been stamped to go into the royal coffers, but fortunately was not melted down. So we get to see some of the brilliance of Aztec, Mixtec metallurgy. So part of this is thinking about then in the colonial period, the fusing of, after the collision of these two worlds that goes by different terms such as hybridity or syncretism when talking about religion, or also this idea of co-creation. This is a wonderful representation of that. This particular aqueduct from Zempoala Tumba, also called the Padre Tembleque, it has this fusion of a Roman-style aqueduct. It has a Christian altar in it, but is done ultimately by indigenous labor, and some of that indigenous knowledge of masonry and adobes in particular that are used for parts of this come out of a context of early New Spain. And so thinking about that in some ways, the subtitle of the book says Forging New Spain. That's a little bit of a tip of the hat to Gamio, who wrote Forjando Patria, and thinking, although problematic from today's lens of his views of mestizaje and indigenous peoples, he was so key to establishing anthropology and archaeology in Mexico. And so this idea that the hybridity is not something that just happened also in the 16th century. Rather, all human culture and cultural production has hybrid elements to it. So when you go to the earliest church in Tlaxcala, built over that former indigenous altepetl, you see a mudéjar roof, which of course comes from Al-Andalus, and it comes from the Arabic style of Spain. And likewise, the Aztecs didn't come out of anywhere, and hopefully that was shown earlier, that the drawing on traditions of the Toltecs and of Teotihuacanos earlier, and how this can be very conspicuous and part of a purposeful framing of social memory. So thinking over here, this of course is the plus ultra, became the motto that Carlos and his son Felipe II used, evoking the Pillars of Hercules and the fact that And here you actually see Hercules from Cadiz, who is associated with the Roman occupation of Gadir at this time, and sailing beyond this point. So Iberia's role as this peninsular hinge between the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds, and then that in the late 15th century, that they had gone further beyond, that the saying "nun plus ultra," nothing further, was breached by a Spanish agency. But then what I love about the above quote is here you have a mestizo Tlaxcalteca, Diego Muñoz Camargo, who wrote his Historia de Tlaxcala, story of his own world, his own people, and knew these classical tropes and this classical tradition, and then wrote a history framing his new social memory and brought it on a boat across the Atlantic to present to Felipe II his own history. So this continues to be a history in flux, a history that's debated and highly meaningful. And of course, we see that today in efforts at contemporary memorialization. The line between celebrating pre-Hispanic indigenous accomplishments, but the potential critique, or the critique of many, of ignoring the plight of contemporary indigenous peoples, the sandwiching of the fraught history of 1521 with the commemoration in other ways of 700 years since the founding of Tenochtitlan, which is playing with the numbers a little, because by most accounts we think Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325, not 1321. And then also the end rather than the start of the independence movement. Usually 1810 was framed more, but for this particular sandwiching of three historical events, the government chose the symmetry of 700, 500, 200. So the ways that is enacted as well. So I'll leave it there because I'm sure that will generate some thoughts and questions from Jaime and members of the audience, but thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Very suggestive ideas on history itself. I will maybe later on ask a question, and now let me introduce Jaime, whom I have already introduced before he arrived. So I'm not repeating the introduction. Very nice to see you, Jaime. So you have the word.
Thank you very much, Adela. First, my apologies for entering late, but I had some connectivity issues that finally I could solve. And thank you for the invitation, David and Adela. The more I read your book, David, the more I enjoy the broad perspective that you give us. And so I will try not to repeat myself from the previous conversation we had a few months ago. So I appreciate, as you were mentioning, this focusing on material things and this emphasis that you put on the co-creative actions of Europeans and Native Americans. I think that it's also part of the title of your book, where you say that it's a collision, which to me at least kind of means as if this event was like an event of nature, not so much an event of culture, that it was just meant to happen eventually. And so I think that positions your perspective very well. To me, I'm not an expert in archaeology by any means, so I enjoyed how you frame it in a very material perspective, this so significant moment in human history, and you put it in the context of actually millennia. So I think that's a very valuable approach. And I focus more when I was preparing my comments for today. I thought that I will focus more on the European side of the event, since for us that study Mexican history and American history, we usually get like a kind of very syncretic view of Spain and Europe. And I think you do a great job of like problematizing a little bit like this, like kind of very schematic history that we usually get about Spain. And now that I arrive, even if I arrive a little later, I noticed that you kind of emphasize the Mesoamerican part of this history, the co-creative actions, as I mentioned, and how you problematize like the unifying ethnic identities of the whole Mesoamerican population. And as I mentioned in our previous discussion of this, I like how you, at least to my eyes, kind of overcome this usual vision of European as the civilized conquerors, even if kind of barbarians in their approach of conquest, but in any case, like how they subalternize and how see the others, the Indians. And this vision of history, I think, is still very common nowadays. And I think you do a very good job in kind of like putting in relatively equal footings those millenary cultures. So just talking a little bit about the Iberian side of things, to me, I really like how you present this long history, deep history of Castile, and how do you place this emphasis that the whole Iberian Peninsula is kind of, just as Mexico, so emblematic of colonized lands many, many times over, beginning with the colonization from the Levant, you know, the Fertile Crescent, how they mixed themselves with the early Europeans, how they displaced them, and how the second wave from the Phoenicians, you know, talking about like the civilization coming from the Levant to the western side of the Mediterranean, and how they became, at least in the southern part of Spain, Carthage, and how they founded Gadir, you know, this long history of Cadiz, the great port of the Atlantic coast, and how they eventually became the Tartessians and the Celtics that were going to again be conquered and colonized by Rome in a very brutal war, but that also presented this very flexible assimilation, how this concept of mestizaje is very prevalent in the Roman Empire, how there were Creoles and mestizos that were Roman citizens as well. So I think that rings many, many familiar bells that most people that study the Americans do not really pay attention. And I think that you do a great job in like bringing this deep history into perspective as a way of better understanding the conquest of Mexico. You don't mention it that much. After the Roman invasion also came the German invasions into the peninsula, particularly the Visigoths, and of course the Christianization, and then of course the invasion of Islam in almost the whole peninsula. And I also was very struck by how you, in a very subtle way, present both the benefits and the evils of empire. We are very familiarized with the evils of empire: slavery, colonization, violence, victimization. But we also need to be very aware of the civilizing power of empire and how it is a mixed bag that, even if it's difficult to present, that we will be very naive, as you were mentioning, like these current efforts of the Mexican government to sandwich history into this very propagandistic package. So I think it is our job to, even if it's difficult to do, to problematize a little bit these very schematic views of history and see how these mestizaje and criollismo ways of the empire and even of Islam were so present in the Iberian world, and how they also were struggling with this ethnic exclusivism that the Germanic peoples brought to Northern Europe. So I think, for example, that's very interesting to explore, how the difference between the Spanish colonization of the Americas differs so remarkably with the colonization of the English and the French, And these differences are usually explained in terms of like the Protestant early modernity versus the medieval Catholicism. But I think it goes way deeper than that. And it's also part of this history of nationalism, ethnicity, broad empire, kingdoms that I think that you bring to the fore, and that we need to really think very carefully about it. So that was like my main comment, like how these deep history traditions and conflicts that are so prevalent in our current global history are also present in this newfound centrality of New Spain in the beginnings of globalization, how all this Mesoamerican deep history is entangled with all this millenary history of Europe, and how these beginnings of a globalized, mestizo, hybrid, syncretic, I don't want to bring that discussion again this time. I do think that it would be ideal if all these terms we could like kind of define them very well, so we can have a more productive conversation when we talk about hybridity, syncretism, mestizaje, transculturality, etc. But this time I just want to mention how it happened in New Spain, this kind of global cultural mestizaje that you so very well described. But it also happened as much in Spain, not only in this millenary history, but also as Cosby brought to our attention, the Colombian exchange it was bidirectional. So like this whole global mestizaje also begins in Spain. And as I mentioned in our previous discussion, the only issue I guess I had with your book is that it stops with the forging New Spain. And I think it kind of lacks a chapter that says forging Spain, because Spain is as much a product of this coalition as New Spain. As you know, Castile and Aragon were not truly a nation, and the very configuration of Spain and the very configuration of Europe comes as a result of this coalition. So those were the main ideas that I thought that we could discuss, and I will leave it there, and hopefully we can engage in a conversation about the ideas you presented and some of these ideas that I briefly presented as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime.
David, I don't know if you want to comment back or you want me to engage a little bit as well.
I could take a few points. I don't know. What do you think for format?
Sure, go. Why don't you do that?
Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Jaime. These are really important points, and I think bring a lot of nuance to thinking about where the sensitive spots are in both in interpretation and both in thinking through what the relevance is for us here 5,000 or 500 years out. You know, the idea of presenting, as you mentioned, like Iberia as a colonized landscape, what I think was important, but not to justify colonization and conquest, of course, but just to show that these were parts of the social memory and historical memory of the conquistadors, and there's actually, you know, legacies of Roman imperialism in Iberia, I mean, that are pretty indelible in certain ways. You know, something I focused on quite a bit recently with colleagues is looking at the differences in societal development in the Americas, in particular Mesoamerica, and in Eurasia, particularly sort of the greater Mediterranean world, and you know, the early states and empires of places like Egypt and Mesopotamia. And you know, there's been a lot of work on this recently. Archaeologists have been looking at, in particular, trying to quantify inequality. And there's lots of ways of doing this that are not totally satisfactory, but thinking about what are the differences in, say, things like living space in houses of your richest and poorest in any given society, or the sorts of material goods that are buried in burials. Even people, will look at things like stature, because all things being equal, those people who had access to better food and health grow larger, and so they're all different indices for measuring inequality. And a pretty consistent result is that early societies of Eurasia were much more unequal than societies in the Americas. And there are a few hypotheses of why this might be true. And they in general focus on resources and the tempo of developments. But for instance, there were no large domesticated animals in the Americas. Except in the Andes, there were camelids, llamas, and alpacas, but there weren't large traction animals for plow agriculture. This does seem to have been a really important variable, because with plow agriculture, more land gets opened up to cultivation, which also means that there could be greater disparities, that who has the ability to control larger tracts of land than others. And so some of the seeds of inequality can be there. And a lot of the technological ramp up, like the traditional narrative that we're fed of human development, often focuses disproportionately on technology. So archaeologists talk about a Stone Age and a Bronze Age and an Iron Age, or changes in maritime technologies and boats getting better. These are all opportunities that can exacerbate inequality. They provide the opportunities for the monopolization of key resources like mineral deposits, or like means of communication. And those, in many cases, were just absent in the Americas, or they were dispersed to a much greater degree, which created systems that we're seeing are in general more equal, at least in status. We're seeing that governments had the ability to be more pluralistic, that there were places like Scala that had a noble council of hundreds of members that non-elites could get into. Cholula was a dual ruler structure with a third important head subject to a council. Even the Mexica, the most sort of imperial group, the Tlatoani wasn't passed on to through primogeniture or through to the next son. Rather, it had to be identified through the council. So there were all these sort of institutions of greater parity and equality in native societies. This, of course, is a point that Wengro and Graeber are making in great detail in their new book, particularly with Northeastern groups. There's a long history of scholarship on this particular point. Nevertheless, popular attention, what does it focus on? Like what the Facebook chat question came in, it focuses on things like human sacrifice, right? And so understanding the context for that, the context for violence and ideas about how one should conduct oneself in battle, and what are done with bodies and the manipulation of ritual dead. And so those waves of conquest that happened in Iberia, as they were ramping up technology, they were ramping up the means of killing people, right? They were ramping up war machines, larger cavalry, larger defenses, larger better weapons. And a lot of that was absent in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, sure, there were some technological change, but the Mexica were fighting with obsidian tools and wood tools. There's no cavalry. There's no very developed maritime battles, although there was canoes, of course, on the lakes. And so that created a different structure for the context of warfare, for the context of ritual violence, where, of course, your incentive as a Mexica warrior was not to go kill people on the battlefield and have elevated battlefield casualties. Rather, it was to strike your makwawit low and name the foe, and then take them back to the state capital for sacrifice to the gods as a form of debt payment, which is just a totally different way of thinking about it than, sort of take no prisoners warfare. The whole point of Mesoamerican warfare was to take prisoners and to connect to this, debt payment to the gods. And it's just a completely different way of thinking about things. And the mental maps and the technology co-evolve together. And when they're disarticulated and put out there in sensationalist media, it makes the Aztecs seem like they're barbaric or had a death cult, and that is of course absurd. Like they just warfare was waged differently, and it comes from these different trajectories of the waves of conquest and the ramping up of the means of killing and battlefield casualties. So there's that point. Let's see what else. Just took a few notes. The idea of hybridity, that is a really thorny one of like, how do we define these terms? They tend to be, and archaeologists have not been happy with the term hybridity, because of course that was first used in a biological context, and does it apply to artifacts, or does it even apply to people in any meaningful way? So I did try to insert the term, although I don't think it'll really catch on, but I'm forgetting whose work I'm drawing on, but I think the term is something like tequisquite, which comes from tequidal or tequio, which of course are the structure of labor relations within Nahua culture and an indigenous society. Just the idea of having a labor tax, which was just long-term, we believe, in certainly in central Mexico. And so then who are the artisans who are making the colonial period churches, who are making the capillas abiertas and the atrios? They're indigenous peoples with that knowledge. And so I like the idea of using a more localized term that expresses those labor relations rather than trying to get a more general term, like something like hybridity. I'll leave it there for now. I don't know if Adela or if Jaime, you have any other things to follow up.
Jaime?
No, Adela, please go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about the last words that you say, David, about how to use terms, thinking about them in a more localized context, and why archaeology brings another dimension of rethinking myths. And when I say myths, I think not that the conquest didn't happen, but the way it has been studied, or not just studied, but why it became an a priori of knowledge to understand modern Mexico. What do I mean? Like, from the perspective of nationalism, that was, the big narrative arc that made us understand what modern Mexico meant. The conquest played an important role in our imaginary and triggered several ideas of historiography or of historical method. And I was just thinking at the first sentences that you say at the beginning of the talk about how, a horizontal line or movement of time, modern history as like advancing or progressing, either in the positivistic sense, we are evolving to a better place, or even in the Marxist sense, a dialectical movement that takes us somewhere else, is combined with the idea of deep history, not in the Brodel sense, but in the archaeological sense, going layers down, and how these two axes makes us think, we that are in the humanities, of ways to rethink those foundational moments. We cannot grab in their entirety, but like maybe material culture gives us a more, or maybe a fresher look at it, and how to disentangle the myth and not find the real, the truth of it, but like maybe to just rethink it. And my comment has to do also with like, we always decide to write books because of our own interest, but because we live in very specific moments in history. And maybe my only question that is more like a reflexive question has to do with, in this moment where we are globally questioning the purpose, political, economic, social of the nation state. Kind of like nation states are in crisis in many aspects, culturally particularly, and there is an emergence of autonomies, groups that transverses nation states, indigenous movements, the idea of indigeneity, Afro-descendant movements that are not really bound to pertaining to the nation state. And in this moment, we come back to these foundational moments. And you bring us this deep history, these layers of previous encounters to the collision of Spain and the Aztec Empire, right? So how do you think your book could impact beyond the field of archaeology, this very specific moment we're living in which, we are trying to define the past for other purposes? And, it just may be something that I was thinking while I was listening to you and Jaime, because the idea of nationalism, or the way the Mexican government is framing the conquest, has to do with this debate, with this huge debate that is not just political in the sense of the Mexican government is portraying it, but it is deeper, it's wider, no? So that's what I came to my mind when I was listening.
Yeah, so, I mean, those are wonderful points. I love to think of, material culture, of course, is what I've mostly focused on. There is something that is tangible to it that I appreciate, and it feels like it can connect you in a tangible way to whomever made that artifact, or that particular architecture that you are communing with in some way. And certainly in writing this book, if you notice, most of the photos are my own. So part of it was an exercise for me of traveling to these places and just immersing myself in place and in physical realities of the materials that are associated with that place. So, that certainly has always been a fulfilling way for me to orient myself of what's going on here. What am I doing? Like, why does this reality exist? Some of that is even my own family history, which we're people who came from Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and were anti-Franco, and fled of Cuba, and my grandparents got married in Cuba and eventually migrated to the U.S. So that sort of transatlantic connection and reality, and I have family from parts of Latin America as a result of that, has always fascinated me. And so part of it is thinking about, well, I mean, we're always rethinking history, and there's always new angles to appreciate history and to frame it. How can we learn about creating better realities that are not so unequitable and exploitative as we've seen in historical chapters? But I don't mean to say that that we're in a better state in any in any event. And so I did want to pull out certain elements that I wanted to elevate to a more non-specialist audience who might not be familiar with the fact that in Aztec society, women could inherit their property to their offspring, and they could divorce their husbands. Like they had, for 500 years ago, or even today in some parts of the world, I mean, they had a status and they had rights that we would appreciate today. And the fact that there was compulsory education in this two-tiered structure in Aztec society are just things I wanted to pull out and juxtapose with the traditional narrative thinking of a non-specialist who might come to this with ideas of, the Aztec were barbaric and the Spanish also were bad, but it's just sort of like there's some justification to that colonial endeavor. And so I think a way of just understanding cultures, it's an anthropological lens of understanding cultures on their own terms and understanding them as part of a broader package, and how material realities and mental maps are in dialectical relations with one another. I think could be a productive exercise from this. I mean, Jaime mentioned the issue of incipient or nascent globalization that came out of that, and so also thinking about that the Trans-Pacific networks were largely Mexican undertakings. I mean, that was those were the galleon trade left from Acapulco. They were framed in this new Spanish context and did really finally link the world. I don't think other people make attempts. They use the term globalization in a smaller scale sense, like that, when the Silk Road was globalization. But I mean, you need to have, like, the Americas need to be involved in that. And so one passage I love that I actually had to be cut at the end of it, but Chimo Pahin, the chronicler of the early 1600s, who he's writing about an encounter that's happening in Mexico City, where there were Spaniards meeting with Japanese emissaries. He calls them Chinese, but I think they were actually Japanese. And it's written in Nahuatl. And so that's just like, and this is like, I don't know, 1602, 1603. I mean, so for those of us who are, schooled in U.S. history, we think of Jamestown or Plymouth as these early colonies, but Mexico City at that point was a globalized city. I mean, it really was a world city by then. And just those global connections, I think, are underappreciated, at least in an Anglophone audience. Like, you don't hear about the innovations that came out of 16th century New Spain and how important that was as this, as the hinge connecting Asia to the Americas to Europe. So that also I would hope would be something that a more lay audience that wasn't familiar with those particular themes might get out of it.
Another thing that I really enjoyed, I don't know, Jaime, you were gonna comment something? Yeah.
Yeah, very briefly about, I'm just thinking about the comment you made, Adela, and the answer that David gave. And it made me think that a little bit that I tried to mention briefly in my response was that to me, as I tried to explain, like, the main value of what David is doing is that, as you said, Adela, I totally agree that the nation state has been like the basis of, if we can still call it, modernity, and this history of modernity, which is also the history of globalization, begins pretty much at this juncture, this collision of worlds. But I think that David, as presenting like this very, very long history, at least to my eyes, like, he shows that the ethnic, the national variable might be not as important as like this co-creation that goes like from the very low levels to the top of the ladder, and how there's this huge continuity there, and how this knowledge, because I think that what defines like this modernity that we live is pretty much like the idea that Europe made a revolution in knowledge. But this revolution in knowledge is in many ways like just a continuity of like very, very ancient traditions that were developed in both sides of the Atlantic Ocean or both sides of the Pacific. And so to me, like, this sense of continuity about the relevance, but also the presence of non-national state factors, I think is very important. And as I also trying to imply, like, the presence of empire, which is nation state in asteroids or something like that, it also plays a huge, huge role. And as you were saying, that the nation state is in crisis, definitely so, but as we are seeing, like, pretty much like a new empire rising, which I'm talking about China, of course, and the American Empire, which is a nation state, but it's also an empire. And so I think that what David does very well is like showing like the very deep layers, as you mentioned, Adela, go like from vertical terms, material terms, and also in this like huge time frame. So if we can use that to create new nation states, new empires, assuming that the empire might be unavoidable, I think those are very interesting questions that we can discuss further.
I hope empire is avoidable.
Well, we could learn from the Tlaxcaltecas. I mean, you know, like, how do you resist empire? I mean, what mechanisms do you put in place to create a more pluralistic system that citizens are invested in and push back against imperial encroachment? And but of course, like Adela, you know, I didn't address the first part of your question, but the sort of, you know, part of the myth history, of course, of independent Mexico included elevating the Mexica and disparaging the Tlaxcalteca, right, as the traders and or a Malinchista, or like those terms that were, of course, came out of that historical narrative that I know is also being rethought within Mexico. So, but those simple tropes are largely abandoned. But I would, you know, when I started working in Tlaxcala 20 years ago, you know, people would say like, why do they call us the traders? Like they wanted to know this, you know, what's this connection? Just this popular history and myth historical tropes, I guess I would call them, which I think there's been much more mature discussion about them, especially the last couple of years because of this quincentennial.
I have to leave in 4 minutes. I will wrap up with Paloma. Paloma will probably read the comment that they put in the chat, but I want to just say that one of the reasons that I think your book is also relevant for our present day is because like here at Lilas, that's something that defines what we are doing here is this idea of horizontal relations with the people we engaged, and how, you know, knowledge doesn't really flourish if you don't establish those type of relations. And I think your gesture of dedicating your talk to Pedro Coahuanzain, Pedro, who was your longstanding collaboration, this local artist, local worker for whom the cultures of Teotihuacan mean much more, just makes more sense to go back to the past. And I think this is something that also defined new work here at Lilas. I think this is what actually makes it more compelling. So I wanted to say that before I go. And there are no more questions. It says Paloma. So let me just read the comment here at the chat. It's from Juan Manuel Arrieta, and it says, anthropology needs to explore deeper the blood offering instead of reruns in the human sacrifices, because that's the main lie that justify the abuse of the American continent. So. Yeah,
I mean, I think those are some of the points I was trying to get at after and replying to Jaime's question. I mean, about the different, like thinking about the broader context of killing and war and how bodies are used, or what killing is justified and what is not, and how those systems could be so different based on, well, this iteration between technology, the advanced technologies of killing that, you know, occurred in Eurasia, versus the mental maps and mental structures that come out of religious systems and social norms that societies decide upon. And for sure, I mean, that you know, the idea fundamental to Mexica human sacrifice is one of debt repayment that comes out of, you know, a religious system that, you know, saw that the gods sacrificed themselves for humanity and required some debt repayment in certain ways, and that's how it was conceived. And a huge part of that came out of warfare. Not all of it. There are other times where people were chosen for sacrifice based on other criteria to be god impersonators and the like. But you know, a lot of that killing came out of a prisoner of war context, and of course, it was elevated at Tenochtitlan, the imperial capital. It's quite interesting if you read. So, for instance, if you read Sahagun's Primeros Memoriales versus the Florentine Codex, in Primeros Memoriales, a lot of the scribes were from Tepeapulco, which was just a smaller, less significant city-state and didn't have the sort of state theater of ritual sacrifice that Tenochtitlan. So then Tenochtitlan did. You do get some of that because some of the scribes were, you know, probably from Tlatelolco also, but there's much more of that influence in say the Florentine Codex or in Duran. And so you know, just using Tenochtitlan as the example of Aztec religion, of course, also isn't correct. It's just, you know, it was one city-state of many. Of course, it was the largest, it was imperial capital, but the way that it was elevated to state theater related to warfare was different there than in other parts of the Aztec world. It's important to see those differences too.
Well, thank you so much, David and Jaime, for participating. And of course, thank you very much to Paloma for making all this happening. And I hope we keep talking in real life.
I do too.
Material culture.
Thank you, Jaime. Wonderful.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Adela.
Bye, David.
And yeah.